Welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi, I'm Fawn Germer.
And I'm Michelle Brigman.
And this is the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast. Today, we have Cara Brookins with us. Her story is so phenomenal that it blows the mind to think about it, because I am sadly the most unhandy person you've ever seen in your life. And she has a story of using YouTube videos and creating a masterpiece like you wouldn't believe. And well, what she did was she built a huge house with YouTube videos and her kids. It's a mind-blowing thing. Cara, thank you so much for coming here. And I just want to get right to it. Tell people where you are, what happened, when it happened, and the whole story.
Oh, well, in a nutshell, first, thank you for having me, both of you. I'm really excited to be here. And where I am is by Little Rock, Arkansas. And I am sitting in a 3,500 square foot house that my kids and I built with our own hands. And we did that not because I was a construction worker. I was a computer programmer for 20 years and a book author. So I was a keyboard person and went through some really devastating things and decided to try to rebuild my life in not just a metaphorical way, but in a physical way, by taking my 4 kids out and building a house by watching YouTube videos.
So give us the pre-story, and then what was the moment when the light went off and you thought, hey, this is what we need to do?
Yeah, the pre-story is with 4 kids who were 17, 15, 11, and 2, so a toddler. I had gone through some really extreme domestic violence, as well as almost a full decade of being stalked. And so the kids and I had both felt and seen some pretty terrible things. And I'd like to tell you that through the course of that, I was really close to my kids, that we all pulled together and we were so strong, but that's not what happens in trauma. Most of the time what happens is that people pull very deeply into themselves and they don't have good relationships with the people around them. And that's where the kids and I were. They were straight A students. They were fantastic kids. Their rooms were spotless. They were doing everything possible to make our life okay, to survive every day. But there were so many things that were outside of our control. There were so many things that we felt victim of. And I came to a point where I knew I'm about to lose these kids. The oldest 2, 17 and 15, about to go off to college. And I knew I had a limited amount of time to pull something together relationship-wise with these kids. And we were about to lose our house because I was financially devastated. And I knew that I had to have a place for these kids to live where they would want to come back. So they had to have a home to come back to and an actual house to come back to. And through the course of that, I started looking at houses. They were broken down. We were going to have to do a lot of work on them. And I came up with the idea, what if YouTube was brand new? What if I just took all the money I can borrow from the bank, buy the supplies, I bet the kids and I can put together a house. And that's how it started.
Nobody does that. No, nobody says, I'll just build a house when they have no possible business building a house.
I truly had no possible business building a house. I was a 110-pound computer programmer. But at that time, I think because of the devastation that we had gone through, because of the isolation that we had experienced, that idea of having this full control of something was so appealing that I thought at the time, absolutely any person who's in my circumstance would do exactly this thing. It looked like the most logical, only solution for us. I thought, I can see now, it was a little bit crazy. But at the time, I honestly thought, well, of course, this is what we're going to do. And because of what we had gone through, so did the kids. The kids weren't like, what are you thinking, Mom? This is crazy. They were like, well, sure, of course we can do that. Now, I should say that we were real DIY people. Now, we never built anything big, but if we wanted a new pair of earrings, our first thought was, oh, I bet I could make those earrings, or a piece of art for the wall. I bet I could, I could try to paint that picture or craft something. So we had this mindset of making things, though they were tiny things. We had made a bookshelf, was the biggest, physical item I'd ever made. And I had this thought that, I know how to use most of the tools. I hadn't used all the tools, but I could cut a piece of wood, I could pound in a nail. And my idea when I started, and this was not correct, but my idea was that building a house is just doing those things a whole bunch of times, and it kind of is in theory, but it's a lot more complicated. And of course, from day one, out here on a muddy construction site, I bought an acre of land. From day one, I realized I'm in way over my head. I am going to have to somehow create skills. I'm going to have to figure out how to do things that are way beyond my skill set, beyond my physical ability. So I'm going to have to modify the way that I do things. It's a 2-story house with a 7-foot tall block foundation that we built ourselves with water we hauled from the neighbor's pond. Because I was the plumber. I ran the gas lines. I did the sewer lines. And because it took me so long to figure out how to do some of those things, like hook my water line into the city main, we had to do things in a primitive way. I laid 1,500 concrete blocks, hauling 5-gallon pails of water from the pond. It was this overwhelming amount of work. But for the first time in my kids' lives, they had full control of something. There was so much power in that.
Well, and I think that's such an incredibly powerful message for so many people to hear, particularly women. What I'd love to dig into a little bit more is, I mean, you haven't gone into it here, but in your book, the amount of violence was absolutely devastating. And so when I hear you tell this story right now, you sound so confident, but I know back then that confident, I mean, you did it, but for those people who are feeling that sense of hopelessness and just, I mean, they could cash in their chips, right? I mean, what's going for them? Because it was such a horrific situation. I mean, how did you really find that strength to say, I am doing it, not I should or I could or it's possible, but actually grab that hammer? And I mean, it was all on you all. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of put your finger on where you are at a moment when you hit rock bottom. And I think that if you've been there in your life, and so many people have, Fawn, I know that you've talked about, what that feels like to feel hopeless, to feel so, rock bottom. I don't know how to pull myself out of this. I'm a pretty stubborn person, so I knew that it was possible. I knew that it was possible for me to get from this rock bottom place to a place where I could enjoy life, where my kids were happy, where we were a close family unit. I knew that was possible. And I knew that it wasn't going to happen by some kind of baby steps, because that's what everybody kept telling me. You're having a tough time. Well, just keep taking baby steps and it's going to get better, sweetheart. No, it wasn't. Like just getting up every day and putting on my socks and making a pot of coffee and stepping out the door was not going to make it better. And I had this idea that I'm so far down that the only thing that's going to make this better, that's going to get us ahead, is to do something extreme. That it's going to have to be some massive kind of a leap forward, not a baby step. And then from there, we're starting at like a new base level. We've leveled up. So that's what it was. It was this idea that if we can just build this house, we can have the physical safety and security of that. And because of the violence and the threats that we'd experienced, physical safety and walls around us was so important in not just a representative way of shelter. And in addition to that, if we could start with this new level of communication and of unity in our family, that, it was this massive level up. And I thought that it's the only way. It's the only way forward. And that's why, I think to me, it felt like perfectly normal. It stunned me when my parents are divorced, but when I called my mom and I called my dad and I was like, so here's what we're going to do. The kids and I are going to build this house. It stunned me that they thought that was a bad idea. And anybody, I'd be at the hardware store looking for, trying to buy my gas lines and asking the guy at Home Depot, which gas line should I buy? Because I'm putting gas lines in my house. And they're like, well, honey, you should probably let your plumber do that. And, I would say, well, I'm my plumber. And they would just be like, holy cow, what are you thinking? You can't do this. And I thought it was stunning. It was, of course I can, because it was my only option. It was the only way forward that I could see, was to do something huge, was to do something that was a challenge to me and myself, to prove to myself and my kids, rather, that to prove to all of us that we could do something big, that we could have this success. And then once you've done that, you can literally do anything. And if you can send your kids into the world like that, sky's the limit. Us, that we could do something big, that we could have this success. And then once you've done that, you can literally do anything. And if you can send your kids into the world like that, sky's the limit.
It's just amazing, though, the idea that, like, how much money did you take to do it? It's a huge, if you were wrong, you were really going to be in deep whatever. And that you wouldn't start with a tiny house or maybe a 1,200 square footer. I mean, you went all the way.
Yes, of course, money was a thing right from the start. I had a good job as a computer programmer, but I was starting from less than zero. So fortunately, I built the house I borrowed the money in 2007, the end of 2007, built it through 2007. I had 9 months on a construction loan through 2007 to 2008. So it was pre-housing crisis. So I qualified for a loan. I borrowed $130,000 and I bought the land. I bought an acre of land and built the house for that. Drew the plans ourselves. My 15-year-old son and I drew the plans at our kitchen table, again, watching YouTube videos. So we drew, very, very simple plans, use those to get the loan, use those plans, pencil drawn, roll them out at the city office and at the bank to get all of, our permits and our loan. And, that's how we started. Now, the house, when we finished it, appraised at $425,000, coming from that $130,000 loan.
Did the 130 count the property too?
No, I bought the land with my kids' college savings.
Gotcha.
So I had to buy that and use that to secure the loan. But yeah, I mean, you talk about pressure, because that amount of money was every bit of the supplies and we ran out. So that I knew right from the start, like, I am going into this with no plan B. And that's one of the ways you can succeed at anything. There's no way out. I'm not going to give myself, well, if this doesn't work out, we can buy a smaller house or we can hire someone to finish it. That would not happen. There would be no money left to buy that house because I'd spent it on the land. There'd be no money left if we figured out we couldn't do it to hire someone to do it. If you come out every day and your only choice is to figure out some way to get those ceiling beams above your head, got to figure out how to do it. And I do all of my projects that way. I don't give a plan B anymore. I never will have a plan B again in my life. When I quit my job to speak full time, I didn't have a plan B. I didn't have enough money in the bank to make it if that didn't work. Right. So that will pull the best out of you. And boy, did it ever, because it took all of the money. And when we ran out of money at the end, I didn't have the money to buy countertops for my kitchen. And I had to have countertops in order to pass my final inspection or the bank would take the house back. So I built concrete countertops, literally like mixing up Quikrete and forming the countertops. Never have liked them, but they work.
Aren't they pretty fashionable these days?
If done properly by a professional, they are.
Well, I think about how, okay, how many people do I know that have built a house through a construction company? And it takes longer than 9 months. I'm sitting here trying to imagine you on this site with these kids, and you did it in 9 months. And some of the stories you shared about, walking to the neighbor's pond with buckets, like, how did you even rally your children together to even, I mean, I can barely get mine to make up their bed, right? So I'm trying to picture what this looks like for the whole family for 9 months to be all in. And I mean, that was some rough physical labor. So how did you rally them every day, and yourself, frankly?
Yeah, it was 9 months of brutal work. I was still writing computer code 8 hours a day. The kids had to go to school, so we weren't out here all day long, but that meant we were out here all night long. It was 20 hours a day. I'm firing up an arc welder at 2 a.m. And thank goodness, even though I had neighbors out here, nobody ever complained, but we are sawing and cutting every hour of the night. In the early days, using headlights before I figured out how to get electricity on site. So yes, we're out here, I mean, just brutally hard, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. And, I have a teenager now. My youngest, who was 2 when we built the house, is just about to turn 16. I can't get him to pick up his socks if he doesn't want to. So I know what you mean about teenagers. But remember, these weren't normal teenagers. These were not teenagers who had experienced a normal life.
Mm.
So they knew that this was their best way forward. And remember that sense of control, which is what we all need. We all need to feel a sense of control over our life. There's something really therapeutic about hitting things really hard with a hammer and that physical activity. And this idea that you can come out with this mud and lumber and pick up a saw and rip through an 8-foot sheet of plywood. That feels good when you have never been able to control anything. And to slowly watch this house rise up out of the ground. I mean, you see it as this muddy acre of land. It's freezing cold. Trying to figure out we didn't even realize how long you have to spend under the mud before you even start building above the ground. You start to see that slowly getting bigger and bigger, and you see the impact that you've had on this. And then pretty soon, one day, you were standing there looking up at this thing you made. I mean, how many times in life do most of us get to build something that's bigger than us, that's physically larger than us, let alone like walk around in it?
What did that feel like that day? How did that feel?
The day we moved in.
Well, whatever the day that it was accomplished. I don't know if that was the day you hammered the last nail or the day you moved your furniture in. Like, what was that day like?
Weirdly, it was like 6 months out. It was like 6 months after living in the house before I think we really felt that. Because, we had 9 months to build the house, to pass all of the inspections, get the certificate of occupancy. But we still hadn't put in the closet shelves, the towel rods, all of those little things that you have to do. So we're finishing some of those little things after we moved into the house. And, also, settling back in at work. I've got a new book contract that I'm writing at night. In fact, the contract to, the book about building the house had already started. And I started to have this sense of doubt. Was it worth it?
Mm.
I started to see the impact that basically a year off social activities had long-term on my kids. The friends they'd lost, the sports that they couldn't do, and now they could never get back on the basketball team, or the sleepovers they'd missed, like all of these things they'd missed out on. The day we moved into the house, my mom, who was 59 years old, had a blood clot in her lung and died.
Oh my God.
The very day we moved in. So I had gone through, after all of this work, where I felt like we're about to level up and life is going to give us a break and we're going to get to coast a little bit. I'd realized that's not actually how life works. And while we've leveled up a little financially and in where we can live, there were a lot of things we left behind, the amount of time I could have spent with my mom, So I was having this sense of doubt. And I was sitting right here in this library working on this book. And my son Drew, who was 16 by then, and my daughter Jada was 13, and they're in the kitchen and having this conversation. She's having a tough time in school. She's not going to make the basketball team. All this stuff is happening. And Drew's giving her these little pep talks. And, everything that she comes up against, he gives her this little no, like, you got this, you can do this, you can do this. And she kept saying, I can't do this, I don't know how. And all of a sudden, Drew, in this like booming voice, says, Jada, you built your own damn house. You can do anything. That was the moment.
That's beautiful.
That was the moment where I was like, it's not about the house. It's not about any of this. They have this thing they're going to take with them everywhere for the rest of their lives. That was the moment that it was worth it and that I could see the full value of it, outside of the physical brutality.
Everybody's going to want to know what it was that you did that went afoul the most, like your biggest disaster story. And if you have multiples, we would love those as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the only one who went to the ER. I guess we can start there. And I did that, I guess, twice. Nothing major, but I still have like a scar above one eye where I had to be glued back together, and lots of bruises. I had a piece of rebar go through my leg, stuff like that. But I think the biggest thing that we went wrong on was the fear that I felt in the beginning and my hesitation to do things, putting things off. Hauling the water from the neighbor's pond was because of that. I was afraid to hook my water line into the city main, but we had this short 9-month deadline, so I had to get all of these concrete blocks piled up. Like I said, the foundation, those concrete blocks are piled up almost 8 feet tall, which makes the house nearly 3 stories tall on one end.
Is that because it's a flood zone?
It's because I built on a hill.
Okay.
And rather than spend a lot of money on the landscaping and bring in tractors and all of that, I opted to build a taller foundation, which was probably not the best move, not the best move a contractor would have made, but it was the only move that I could do without spending more money. It was time and work rather than money.
And harder.
So much harder. So, because we had to haul all of the water from the pond and set all of these blocks, and it's freezing cold, it's winter, it's December and January. It took nearly 2 months to build that foundation. Now, I could have hired a crew to do it in probably a little over a weekend. So that foundation was our biggest physical work mistake in every direction. My fear to put in the water line, hauling the water from the neighbor's pond, which took 2 months. Then when I finally had to do that water line, when the city inspector came, he's going to come inspect the blocks and all of the pipes that you have to put through the foundation, he said, of course, I'll come and inspect it as soon as you put in your water line, which obviously I was always going to have to do. It's never going to go away. It's never going to get any easier. Could have done it from the start. And it took me about an hour to do it when I went down there and did it.
Okay, that is the biggest story everybody needs to learn about anything they're doing. You just delay the most unpleasant thing. And if you just suck it up and do it, it took you an hour.
It took me an hour. It would have saved us weeks of work. Hauling water from a half-frozen pond in 5-gallon pails, washing, like crouching in the mud at the end of every day to wash our tools in a pond down the hill.
You were doing like Quikrete. It was like, I just want people to appreciate whenever I was reading it, it's like the Quikrete bags, doing this by hand and what, like, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's worse than Quikrete because it's mortar. So it's not like Quikrete is everything in one bag. It's got your aggregate, which is the gravel. It's got the Portland cement and the sand. So I had like a dump truck of sand, and then I had these 80-pound bags of mortar mix that, they weighed almost as much as I did, trying to carry them across the site. And I had this way of carrying like between my legs where I said I would ride them across the job site because I had to like clench them between my knees as I tried to carry them. But then you're mixing the mortar with sand, shovels of mortar, and then buckets of water, mixing that by hand in a wheelbarrow and then mortaring it onto these blocks. So tremendous amount of work. We will
bring baggage with us way too long in our lives.
Yeah.
That we need to just release.
So ultimately, the house that you got, would you say it's a well-built house, or that next time you'd like to get an outside contractor to do it?
Well, both. I would say it's a very well built house, but I don't want to do that again. Nothing has ever fallen down. People are always like, "Is the house okay?" I've lived in it for like 12 years now. We've never had any major problems. In fact, I overbuilt every element of it. I can stand like a 12-foot snow load here in southern Arkansas, where we do not get snow except this year. I overbuilt the rafters. Instead of using 2x4s for the walls, I used 2x6s. It's extremely energy efficient. That was part of my plan going in, to make it inexpensive to live in, not just inexpensive to build. So, every element of it, I went overboard in how I built it. So never any problems with it, but gosh, I do not want to do it again. Every now and then, especially my oldest son, Drew, will say, well, when we build my house, I want to do this. And I'm like, oh, didn't you learn your lesson? But if or when he does, I'm there, right? Like turnabout's fair play. He built this one. I'll be right there on his.
Michelle, have you ever heard of anybody doing something like this? Never.
No,
right?
No, never.
But you have reached thousands and thousands of people with your story. Has that inspired other people to do it?
I get the craziest stories every day. I mean, from people who are building houses or boats to one guy, like, you inspired me. I always wanted to become a ninja, but I never would tell anybody. So like, I'm becoming a ninja now. So many books, people writing books, people starting careers, businesses. I get from all over the world. And I think that is the coolest thing.
Yeah.
Our story was part of the high school exam, like I guess it's like an ACT in Tunisia. And it was like the reading portion of the story was us. So I had thousands and thousands of these high school graduating students reach out to me just this last year when that happened, to say, oh my goodness, you're a real person. We didn't know you were real. And then they send me little voice messages through Instagram, and thousands of them to say, I love what you did. Now I'm going to do this. And, the story had 2 billion hits. And in the first 2 weeks, I was 75 countries that we had done these interviews in.
2 billion hits.
2 billion hits around the world. It came out in every country on every major news station. And it was the craziest roller coaster, from doing, Good Morning Indonesia, Good Morning Turkey, Good Morning Poland, Good Morning Italy. It was nuts.
Man, that's really Kardashian territory, isn't it? Or beyond.
It was so crazy. And, of course, every language, we had Japanese TV crews here doing shows, and, through our house, the Today Show, and, just very, very strange. Especially when I think back to when we started to build the house, we told no one. Obviously my parents knew, but the coworkers that I sat next to writing computer code 8 hours a day did not know I was building a house. My kids' friends, except their very best friends, did not know we were building a house. We were ashamed of it. This idea that our life had fallen that low,
Wow.
that our only solution, our best solution, was to be out here in the mud. And that was not my typical place to be. I mean, we were involved in politics. We had dinners at the governor's mansion. My kids and I had a very different, more normal life. The idea that we had to come out here and swing a hammer every day, and that I'm learning how to use an arc welder and mix concrete, it was embarrassing. And that I had let, it was my decisions that had put us there, right? Like, I had made the decisions that brought this violence, this fear, this trauma into our house. And I had put us in a position that got us there. Now, it's not all my fault. I didn't do this, but I made the decisions that got us there. So the idea that I had left us emotionally devastated, financially devastated, and that this was our only way out, there was a tremendous amount of shame. I never planned to tell anybody. I didn't take a single picture on the construction site. The only photos I have are the ones that my mom or my dad took when they visited. Of course, we didn't have cell phones like we do now. I think we probably would have had pictures then, but I had a BlackBerry that didn't have a camera on it at the time. And, my kids had little bitty pixelated cameras. So we didn't have that easy camera, but none of us wanted to share that.
Well, and it's interesting that the 2 billion hits, your story, I imagine, is resonating. I know it resonates for me because it is this story of overcoming, of stepping into your power, of recognizing your worth. It's for, contributing and the strength and resilience. But when that story got picked up, was it picked up because here's a crazy woman building a house from YouTube? Or like, you know what I'm saying? Like, would a man have gotten this initial interest from the news outlets? Because it turned into something very different. I'm just curious of your thoughts.
But I talk about that all the time, but you are the first person who has called that to attention. And I think it's so important because it was brought out as this motivational, inspirational, you can do anything if she can do that, which is how I wanted it to happen. And I wasn't sure it would, right? When I wrote the book, I thought, like, is this going to come out? What did this lady do? Make her kids build a house? Like, this is terrible. Like, it could have gone any way. And, or it could have been more of the focus on the domestic violence, which I'm always fine having that be part of the focus. But the goal is always like, I'm the least likely person on the planet to do this. And if I could do this, then you can do anything. Like, that's where I wanted the focus to be. And thank goodness it was. But the point about a man building a house, he should get every bit as much attention as I did, right? Because it's really freaking hard and men do it all the time. And I'm always stunned that I cannot say I have ever spoken at an event where I did not have a woman come up to me afterwards and say, we did this. I did this with my dad, with my husband, where a woman played. I haven't met someone who the woman was the soul, the soul's person driving it forward, but always that women were very much involved at every single event I speak to. So I'm not the first person to do something like this. Maybe I did it in a slightly more extreme way so that it got a bit more attention, but I'm not the first person to do it. The fact that I did it big also got a lot of attention. And, that was so much of that was just ignorance. So much of what I did, it was just, I didn't realize how hard this was going to be. When you're drawing a house on a piece of paper and you're letting your kids draw their own bedrooms, it gets really big really fast. And that's how that happened. Of course, when you look at the square feet, we're like, that's a lot of square feet. But it was smaller when we drew it than it was when we built it, because there was a whole section of the upstairs that isn't supposed to be there. It wasn't in our plans. But after I built the bottom floor and we started framing out the second floor, it was like a really complicated plan that in my head I would know how to do. It was these steep angled roof lines and all of this stuff. I couldn't figure out how to build it. So instead of doing that, we just built more upstairs. So the house is as big as it is because we couldn't figure out how to build it small.
Meant to be. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk a little about just the notion of, were you safe when you were doing it, and how you got to a point where you felt safe and everybody did, and became a little more whole in the process. Back in a second.
Hey, Fawn.
Hey, Michelle.
Okay, we have all these amazing women that are sharing their stories on this podcast, but what do we do now so it is not a bunch of talk and no action?
Well, that's the easy part. Everybody just head over to the Women's Leadership Network at womensleadershipnetwork.com. And wowza, this is the ultimate mastermind and masterclass for career women. So if you're looking for coaching and inspiration from some of the most accomplished and influential women of our times, and you don't want to pay $1 million for it, you've found your tribe.
All right, so what do we get?
Coaching, courses, community, and connection.
What's that website again, Fawn?
Well, that's the easy part. womensleadershipnetwork.com.
Okay, so you talked about the trauma that you and the family had been through. At what point were you safe? And then how did you grow into that feeling that you were safe and didn't have to worry any longer?
I think that anybody who's gone through trauma that directly impacted their safety and their children's safety, it carries that with them in some way forever. I mean, there's a certain amount of post-traumatic stress reaction that will always be part of my life and my kids' lives. And I think most of the time we don't notice it until maybe we're around, somebody else, and we're like, oh, that's not how we do things. So while we were building, we were still in danger from, the man who had paranoid schizophrenia, who was still, coming after us, or potentially could come after us. So
He
we
was
were still,
stalking you still?
yes, yes. So, there was always the sense of looking over our shoulder, and this idea of, I suppose it's a bit of paranoia when you come into an open job site like this, a construction site, where you think, wait, is that where I left that? Or didn't I leave that somewhere else?
Right.
Did one of you move that, or was somebody here? So we had, that sort of going on. So there was that sense. Um, and that continued. I mean, that was part of how we designed the house. And this is when I realized that we suffered from post-traumatic stress, is the way we designed the house was tactical. We designed it with 8 cameras in the exterior, so you could see every element of the exterior, with a monitor that would always be on the interior, like building security. When we planned the location of the staircase and the walls at the top of the stairs, everything was tactical so we could defend our position. And I realize now that that is not how most people design a house.
Right.
Location of windows, how we built doors, everything was built with pretty extreme security in mind. Even, we do keep handguns in the house and know how to use them and where those would be placed. So, I know now that, while all of that is fine and can be healthy, that you have to, fully understand that that probably wasn't a healthy mindset going in. When we actually felt safe, strangely, as we're building, the stronger we felt physically and the more in control of our lives we felt, the more we had the idea that we could defend ourselves, and that we created more scenarios where we would be able to defend ourselves. That sort of empowering feeling carried through to reality, that physical strength. And when we were actually safe, was quite a few years later, after we'd moved into the house. Several years later, I finished writing Rise, which took me almost 6 years to write. And it was actually with my agent, and I was worried about publishing it because we had not heard from the man who was stalking us for a couple of years, and worried that publishing this would potentially start this all over again. And while I was trying to make that decision, he actually died by suicide, which he had attempted many times. And he actually cut his stomach open at a Starbucks. And and of course, mental illness is horribly cruel, unfair thing. Here's this person who, through no fault of their own, slowly and horribly lost their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And and was a victim themselves to this. So I have a tremendous amount of compassion for that, at the same time that I would have defended myself and my children against it in every single way possible. So I, at that time, when I heard that he had died, I would have told you before that. The day before, I would have said, I barely think about it. I think about it like once every couple of weeks. It crosses my mind. But after he died, I realized that there were multiple times every day where I had to have the thought, oh, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Oh, that's gone. And I didn't even know that it was that ever present in actions that I took and things that I did, from going for a walk to, just everyday things, that I didn't have to look over my shoulder in the same way anymore. So it was a long time. It was a long time.
And I don't want to hog this, Michelle, but there's one other thing I want to hit on, just because of you saying that there were the decisions you made, you put them into the situation. And I always want to be really careful with victim blaming and victim self-blaming, because I don't want people to think they're these horrible people and then they don't make changes in their lives because they think, they feel so bad about themselves. So is there any reckoning with that at all?
Well, I mean, of course there is. Well, I made decisions. I made choices. I made them with the best information I had at the time. My information was faulty. I was manipulated. There are so many things that go into an abusive relationship and in landing in an abusive relationship. And it is such an effective and systematic destroying of a person that happens through domestic violence. And, whether that's physical, emotional, the whole realm of it is so systematic and effective that is not your fault. None of that is your fault. And staying in that situation is not your fault because you have been programmed and they are using every element of the way that our brain works to keep you there. So I think the most profound thing I learned after I left and was feeling pretty bad about myself for staying as long as I did in this situation was I started speaking at some domestic violence shelters. And this was just like a journaling kind of talk that I did. And I kept expecting, week after week, I was expecting these women to walk in who were weak, who were beat down, who were timid. And every week I was stunned that these women walking in were strong, they were stubborn, these were fierce women. Yeah. And I realized that that's part of the problem. It is these fierce, strong women who are so determined to fix a situation, who are determined that if they can stay, that they can alter this in some way, that those are the women who land there and stay there longer. And what I could then tell these women after I learned that, and also for the first time tell myself, is that you've already proved how fierce you are. You just had it pointed in the wrong direction. Yeah. Now that you're out, you have everything inside of you, all of the power, all of the stubbornness, all of the fierceness to do anything you want. Point it in the right direction and you're unstoppable.
It's what is so interesting is that in our prep for getting the podcast ramped up, we've done a lot of these interviews in advance so that we're ready. And the shocking thing is they're all super women. How many times the subject of domestic violence has come up again and again and again. And that, all of you show you're bigger than that. You get beyond that. And it's very inspiring, but also very sad because you realize how many people are still stuck in it. And I love your message of getting unstuck because that is what changes lives.
Right. And, we've all felt that. And it's not always that sense of stuck. And it's not always because you've gone through trauma. I talk to a lot of people who have, and it's not always domestic violence. It's, somebody you lost. A lot of us have experienced tough things. But a lot of the times when we feel stuck, it's not even that. It's not even the trauma. It's just this idea of, we're stuck in a job and every day starts to feel the same and we need something bigger and different. And it's so hard to make those changes. So, that's a lot of what I talk about and try to help people through is that when you feel stuck, whether it's the boredom stuck, the restless stuck, or the trauma stuck, it's the same brain pathway to get away from all of those kinds of stuff. So the same kinds of ways of motivating ourselves and the same little tricks work.
What were a few of those tricks?
Oh, goodness. I use so many of them. One of my favorite ones that I use a lot, when I have a project that I want to do, or I have a project idea, building the house is a good example of it. I was going to start building the house. So I could have planned that for years. I could have had 5 years to build a house. It would have taken me 5 years to build a house. But the way to get started really quickly, I call it making a mess. I ordered all the lumber, had the pile of lumber out here, and your brain naturally wants to attack that. How do you keep your hands off of that once it's there? Another really quick example, I had a wall in my dining room I didn't like. In fact, the Today Show was coming the next day. So my daughter printed off 9 pictures off the internet from a free graphic site. We framed them, hung them on the wall. I hated it. We'd always going to change it, but it was there for years. And then one day I was like, the only way to change that is I went in there, I pulled all the art off the wall. And this was 2 weeks before a Japanese film crew was coming through. I pull all the art off the wall, pull the nails off, and I lay them on the table. I've got no choice now, right? I have to fix it. So it's that idea of make a mess. We had to move shuffle these things around. There's holes in the wall. We've got somebody coming. What do? I have to fix it. So I use that all the time. I'll just pile stuff up. And I know that we can get used to living in a messy space. So you have to be careful how you do it and very intentional about how you do it. But don't put it off in the corner. Put it in the middle of the room. Put it in front of your TV. Make a mess. Our brains don't like that chaos. So that's one of my favorite ones.
I love that. Well, Cara, you are a light. So thank you for just, it is shining bright with you. And I think about how touching and moving and inspirational your story is. And also just what a gift that you've given your own children, because look, life's hard. And yes, there are things that we're going to do in our lives that we, by our own bad choices. And there are things that we're going to experience just because it's part of life. But how you handle it and how you overcome and again, lean into your power. The fact that I know all of your children are doing really, really well and just have been amazing examples of what that experience taught all of you. I think it's amazing. There were a couple of other things that you'd said today that really resonated with me. And I like the part about sometimes you just have to back yourself into a corner to remove all the options to move forward, a little bit like what you mentioned with making a mess. And then the other thing that came through was really knowing your why. You knew why you were in, and you put yourself in a situation where you're like, I'm going to do whatever it takes. So I think it's important for people to step back and really focus on what is the feeling and what is the why. And it's got to be an emotional thing, not a accomplishment that sounds good to everybody else. I also really resonated with the fact that fear only makes the objective harder. So don't let it overcomplicate and hinder you from getting where you need to be faster. And I think the last couple of things is I think you've just given a great story around the importance of focusing on mental health, the importance of domestic violence, and just the importance to the world of telling your story. So for people, I know they're going to want to get closer to you. Obviously, the book Rise is amazing. How else can they connect with you?
Well, I hang out on Instagram, of course, and all this, Twitter, Facebook, all of them. And from my website, carabrookins.com, you can get to any of those wherever you like to hang out. I'm about to try to start TikTok too. So that's like my new thing.
Oh, that'll be fun.
I don't know if that's like the young hip thing to do, or if it's older people have moved there now and that's why I'm there. Whatever. Anyhow,
everybody's there. But my daughter tells me all the time, she's like, cooking and DIY. Like, can you get something more interesting on your page? I'm like, well, that's what resonates with me. But thank you so much for being with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And we look forward to seeing what great things are next.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you both so much. You made this a lot of fun, and I'm ready for whatever's next. I'm ready for the new world.
Oh, you are amazing. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.